philosophy.
What is and what is not true.
Those who know themselves.
Being better every single day.
Hey there, welcome back once again to the Think Grow podcast, where personal development meets real life. I'm your host, Ruben Chavez, and today I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Amir Levine. Dr. Levine is a board-certified psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. He graduated from the residency program at New York Presbyterian Hospital at Columbia University, where he is still actively engaged in research. Dr. Levine has a private practice in New York City where he lives, and he deals with people of all ages, adults, children, and adolescents. So, very distinguished and accomplished person. We have a great conversation about attachment theory. He wrote a book called Attached, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. My wife and I read it together. Attached is all about, like I said, attachment theory, which is essentially how you relate to people in romantic relationships. I'm going to just read you a short paragraph about attachment theory and what it is and what are the different attachment styles, so you get a brief overview of what it is that you're going to be listening to here. Okay, this is from the book Attached. Adult attachment designates three main attachment styles or manners in which people perceive and respond to intimacy in romantic relationships, which parallel those found in children: secure attachment, anxious attachment, and avoidant attachment. Basically, secure people feel comfortable with intimacy and are usually warm and loving. Anxious people crave intimacy, are often preoccupied with their relationships, and tend to worry about their partner's ability to love them back. Avoidant people equate intimacy with a loss of independence and constantly try to minimize closeness. Okay, so that's just a short synopsis of the idea and concept of attachment theory. Of course, Amir goes into detail about all of that in our conversation here. He talks about exactly what attachment theory is, how it came about, how we can apply it to our lives, and why it's useful to know what our attachment style is. So if you've had trouble with relationships in the past, or even if you haven't, attachment theory, I think, is a really useful lens through which to view your behavior and the behavior of others. So I'd really recommend checking out the book, but at the very least, listen to this episode. Amir is a very interesting guy, has an interesting background, and is a great teacher. So without further ado, here is Dr. Amir Levine. It's very difficult to find anything about you online, any interviews, any content at all. So I feel very honored that you're taking the time to speak with me. The only thing I found was a talk that you gave about marijuana and the developing brain, I believe, the adolescent brain. Right. Yeah. So it wasn't exactly relevant to this conversation, but it was interesting nonetheless. The other thing I was going to ask you, Amir, again, thank you for being here. Something that struck me and that stood out to me in reading about you and your life was that in high school, you wrote a paper about birds of prey and comparing the different birds of prey in the Bible to ancient Assyria, if I remember correctly, and Babylon. That's quite a topic for a high schooler to engage with. Why and how did you pick that topic?
Right. So it's an interesting way of starting a conversation. It's like you dug that information up about me. It's a little bit embarrassing, but I'm glad you did.
I have to say also that I looked very hard for that paper because I wanted to read it. It sounded fascinating. Like I wanted to actually read that paper, but I couldn't find it. So, yeah.
So I'll tell you, and maybe that also it does relate to the book, and it ultimately really relates to attachment. So I had a very unusual upbringing. The fact that my mother, I should start with my mother, was a very unusual educator. She was a science writer and a science editor, and she works for a science magazine in Israel. And she grew up in a kibbutz, which is kind of like a commune. Basically, their way of looking at education was very unusual. They didn't give any grades. They let people study at their own pace. It was all agricultural commune, so they had to work in agriculture and other things, and then also work and then study. So I didn't grow up in a kibbutz. I grew up in Jerusalem, in the city. But my mom really held to the same beliefs. So whenever I wanted to stay home, I could stay home, especially on days that there were exams. I didn't have to go because she didn't believe in exams or she didn't believe in grades. So I had a lot of freedom to really pursue things that interested me. And that whole thing, that's also interesting how things come about. So I did stay at home and I read a lot and I pursued my interests. And I wanted to do this whole project in high school. And we have to study Bible studies in Israel, but it's not religious. It's actually very secular. So part of it was about animals and how animals are portrayed in the Bible. And my best friend wanted to do it about the lion. So I said, well, what's the next best thing? It will be the eagle and the representations and birds of prey in the Bible. And I was lucky actually because it's a very interesting topic. And that's how I got to get to that place. And because of my mom, I was able to not go to school many, many days and just like go to the university and talk to all these professors and go to different libraries and different archaeological digs around the country. And I was sure that I was going to become an Assyriologist, which is like an ancient civilization that started at the cradle of human civilization in the Mesopotamian region, where is now, I think, part of Iraq. But I think if it wasn't for my mom and her love for learning and the safety that she gave me to learn at my pace and what I wanted to learn, then I would never have gotten to have done this. And I think I would never have written this book. So a lot of it is really thanks to her and her sort of teaching me to follow my intellectual curiosity and intellectual pursuits. And so there's always this interaction between, and you'll see it's a very much part of attachment. There's the exploratory drive and there's the attachment. And they're very, very closely linked to each other. And when we feel safe from an attachment perspective, then our exploratory drive kicks in and then we can create better and do a lot of things that if we don't feel safe, we won't be able to do.
Yeah, that does relate. I actually hadn't thought of how that parallels attachment theory, but that makes a lot of sense. I do want to get into attachment theory. Your background is so varied and it's so interesting that I wanted to ask you one more question about kind of that whole philosophy that your mom had about letting you stay home and follow your interests, because it seems like you're obviously a very accomplished person. You're a professor at Columbia right now. And I also read that you got into some trouble sometimes with staying home, and having that freedom sometimes got you into trouble. How did you maintain that balance between grades and, keep like actually staying on track to become a professor and keeping your actual academic life in line while pursuing your interests? Like, did that ever, those two are obviously in tension, I assume, but how did that play out?
So I think I was lucky, actually. There was one thing, sometimes that sort of shows you how, and it's also related to some of the things that we're going to talk to. You're hitting it right on the mark. I think what really played in my favor was that I was quite anxious about failing. So even though I would go and do things and I had like this whole exploratory drive and I was so curious about pursuing different things, I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to get a bad grade and I was anxious about it. So that gave me sort of that fear of actually not doing well, gave me the motivation to then catch up and try to learn things on my own. And I did a lot of studying on my own. And it was my experience that there's just a lot of time is being wasted in school. And I've always loved to learn on my own. It's something that once you're giving that ability and that space to study on your own, if you really like to read, and then if you're giving the permission to do it, it really gives you the impetus to do it. But I was quite anxious that I wanted to do well. So that kept me at least sort of trying to go. Like if I could get out of an exam, I would have. And sometimes I was able to because my mom didn't really force me to go to school on days that there were exams. She would give me a note that I didn't go. I don't know if today it would fly so much because I think like schools are much more tougher in terms of attendance.
Mm-hmm.
But back then I was able to do it, and I'm thankful
Grades
for
didn't
that.
suffer much?
Yeah, no, not at all, actually.
That's great. Oh, obviously. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I agree with that assessment that a lot of time is wasted in schools. I wasn't a real avid student. I wasn't super diligent. I mean, I got decent grades and maybe even good grades, but I would say that it was only when I got out of school and in recent years, I would say in the past 6, 7 years, that I really had an intellectual awakening, I would say, because I was trying to understand the world. I've really been trying to understand current events, politics, how everything's been shifting, these cultural issues. And so from that was the impetus for me to really start my real education. And I agree that you can study. I've learned so much by following my interests and by following my excitement and my natural curiosity. So I definitely agree with you there. I wanted to ask you, I guess, as just a basis for our conversation, how did you get into attachment theory and how did you get into studying it? What drew you to it? What was that path like?
So, sort of going again along the same idea of following your interests and how powerful of a motivator that is. I was in the midst of doing so after I finished medical school. I did my adult residency in psychiatry at Columbia, and then I did the child and adolescent residency also at Columbia in psychiatry. And one of the rotations was something that's called a therapeutic nursery. And in the therapeutic nursery, we'd worked with toddlers, kids, and young mothers that had post-traumatic stress disorder. And oftentimes, the kids would elicit symptoms of PTSD in the mothers. Let's say the kid would yell or throw a tantrum or make it like a jerky movement. And that would cause the mothers to either withdraw or go into a flashback and be less available for the child. And for a child, part of attachment is the whole idea of like maintaining availability. So if a child senses that the mother is not available, they can sometimes engage. See, there's this lingo in protest behavior. Mm-hmm. And so it creates a very, very difficult relationship because of all these PTSD symptoms. So we used attachment-related therapy to help recreate a more secure, safe bond between the mother and the child. And I was taken to it right from the get-go. I really loved that work, and it was so powerful that it made me do something that I haven't done in all of the other rotations. Usually you get a really, really long reading list, and no one really has the time to read everything that's on the reading list. It's kind of more of a suggested reading list. I went and I read everything that was on the reading list and even sort of went further. And that's when I actually found that there's this whole area of research that I've never really came across that's called adult attachment. And I just found it really fascinating. And at the time, I was going through a breakup myself, and it really helped me understand so much about the different dynamics in that relationship that didn't work out. It was such a relief to read like a really science-based description of what my thoughts and behaviors were like and what the other person was like and why it didn't work out. And it really felt like a light switch went off. And actually, now a lot of the time I get emails from readers saying that reading the book was like a light bulb going off in their head or like an eye opener. And that was I'm glad that I was able to convey some of the feeling because that's exactly the experience that I had when I went through this. And then I called my best friend from high school, Rachel, and I told her, Rachel, this is really great. We have to do something about this. We have to write a book because it hasn't, at that point, that whole idea of attachment styles and how it pertains to everyday life, it hasn't been translated into everyday life. Sure, people knew in research to use attachment styles and that it can predict like long-term relationship, adult romantic relationship satisfaction, but no one really used it into either in therapeutic settings. I shouldn't say no one. People used it in couples therapy about how to create a more secure bond between people. But no one's actually taught people, oh no, different people have different attachment styles. The idea of sort of implementing the attachment styles in everyday life and teaching people about attachment styles wasn't out there. And so that's why we decided to write this book.
That's awesome. Can you just give as kind of a foundation for people, just an overview of what attachment theory is exactly? Like, what is it trying to describe? What is it doing? I found it to be a very valuable framework, but what is its purpose? Just talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Right. So attachment, the father of attachment theory is John Bowlby. I think he's a British psychoanalyst who worked with kids. And he's the one who first said, before that, Freudian theory looked at the way that kids attach to their parents. And they said, well, kids attach because the mother is a source of sustenance, food, and they keep them alive and they give them food. So that's why they attach. And Bowlby came and said, no, like it has nothing to do with it. Attachment is a basic need, just like food and water. And he saw that because he actually worked in orphanages. And he also, during World War II, during the Blitz, a lot of kids were sent up north to northern England. And kids, they didn't have the time to take care of them. They just like fed them, they gave them their clothing, they took care of their needs, but they didn't really have the time to give them the attention that they needed. And a lot of these kids failed to thrive. And so then he deduced, no, attachment is a real basic need, just like food and water. And that is very important. And I'm going to demonstrate to you throughout this talk why, like, even though we kind of say, yes, it's a basic need, how it comes to be in different interactions in everyday life. That like we don't fully understand what it means. But with time, you can understand better and better what it means. So that's this one idea that it's like we need to attach to other people and we can't really do without it. And the other idea is that attachment, the way that I think about attachment, is that's how we feel safe in the world. Mm-hmm. People think that we feel safe through, I don't know, if we have a lot of money in the bank, if we're famous, if we'll have all these different attributes. But that's not how we feel safe, because the brain system that's designed to make us feel safe, all these material things that potentially can make us feel safe in today's world didn't exist when this brain system was designed. That brain system was designed when all we had was our clan around us. And so safety, we feel safe through other people. And it's basically the way that I see it, it's a surveillance mechanism. And we all have certain people that make us feel safe. And we have an attachment hierarchy. And I can even tell you that it's constantly working in the back of your head. And it kind of like knows where your loved ones are. But I can tell you that if I were to tell you that, I don't know, somewhere where your loved ones are, some terrible earthquake happened, or I don't know, a terrorist attack or something terrible, you wouldn't be able to have this conversation with me anymore. You'd have to stop and reach out to them, make sure that they're okay. And then once you know that they're okay, it goes back to baseline and you can resume whatever you're doing. So that's kind of like the idea about attachment. It's how we feel safe. And we have an idea about where all these important attachment figures are in our lives and that they're okay. But if we disrupt that, we become very unsettled. On the other hand, you also have this, like if something bad happens to you, you probably you have an attachment hierarchy. If something bad happens to me, immediately who you're going to go to and who you're going to sort of seek help from. And if not this person, then there's number 2 and there's number 3. We all have these attachment hierarchies. Dogs have them too, by the way. And then other animals, that's why I really like dogs. You can see a lot of attachment stuff with pets and dogs especially. And so that's in general how I think about attachment.
It seems like the way you described it there, and in your book also, that it would be linked to, it would help explain grief also, because when you are attached to somebody, they're regulating your nervous system to a large degree. At least that's how I understand it. And so when that person is no longer here, like when someone passes away, for example, I could see how you're now left with a void there, and you're left very vulnerable there and emotionally dysregulated. Is that an accurate way of looking at it?
I think so. I think what happens when you lose someone, so when you know that someone is there, then part of the whole thing about attachment is to kind of like reach out to them and try to make sure that they're available. But then when you know that the other person is not available anymore and there's nothing that brings them back, you go through this whole process of putting that whole system at bay, because it doesn't matter how much protest behavior you're going to do. It doesn't matter how many times you're going to call them or text them or yell at them or be upset with them. Nothing that you can do, or like ignore them, nothing that you can do will bring them back. So then you have to start resolving that whole idea that they're gone and somehow internalize them, potentially, if you're successful, and sort of make them part of you, internalize their memory. So now they're inside you and you can carry them with you and the memory with you and make it into something meaningful. And it's a long process, and it does for sure involve many, many different neurocircuitries that are related to grief.
That makes sense. The way I conceptualize the attachment styles, and you can tell me what you think about this, I've spent some time studying personality psychology, particularly the Big Five framework has been a really useful framework for me. And you describe in the book how the different attachment styles likely evolved, in our ancestral environment in response to different social challenges that we had. Sometimes you needed to be more anxiously attached, sometimes you need to be more securely attached, and then other times avoidant was actually appropriate. And so in the same way, I've seen the different traits that we have spoken about in that same way in an evolutionary context like that. Neuroticism has been useful to us, so has conscientiousness, etc. But the way I conceptualize the attachment styles, in some sense, is as kind of relationship personalities, like little mini personalities that we have in relationships. Is that something that is helpful, or is it appropriate?
I think it's very helpful. I think so. I'll give you a little bit of a background of how these attachment styles were discovered. So the person who discovered these attachment style was Mary Ainsworth, and she's mentioned right up there together with John Bowlby as the most important contributors to attachment theory. And what she did, she designed this test, this experiment that's called the strange situation test. And the strange situation test, there's still labs today that use it. It's remarkable. It's a remarkable finding that she's had about this attachment style and how she designed this test. And you can look it up on YouTube. It's really fascinating to see it. And what is done in that test is that you bring a toddler and the caregiver, the mother or father, to a room full of toys, and then you observe them through a one-way mirror. And there's also the research assistant in the room. And then typically what you see, you walk in with a toddler and he or she, they see all these new toys there and start pointing at the toys and want to play. And then at some point you ask the caregiver to leave the room. And invariably, you have to sit watching on YouTube and you'll see the child immediately drops whatever they have and sort of rushes to the door, starts banging on the door, starts crying, really crying for their mother or father, wanting them back. And then the research assistant tries to distract them, interest them with a toy or something. They don't care, throwing it in her face or in his face. And then they ask the caregiver to go back into the room. And it's in that moment of the reunion that Mary Ainsworth identified 3 attachment styles. And then later on, Mary Main found the 4th one. And the 3 are the anxious, the avoidant, and the secure. So if the parent was able to pick up the child and they would calm down very quickly and start, again, pointing at toys and looking at things, they had a secure attachment style. If the child with an anxious attachment style, the parent would pick them up and it would take them time to soothe and calm down. And sometimes they would calm down, and all of a sudden, again, start crying again. It's called a calm-on-calm paradigm, which we also see in adults. But it would take them a long time to become interested in the new toys and playing again. And the avoidant, they don't seem to be too perturbed by the fact that the parents left, or even if they're upset when the parent comes back in and they pick them up, they don't really embrace the parent as much, but they also don't become as interested in playing again. So they're not as upset, but they're also not as easily soothed. So that's the avoidant attachment styles. And so it's those 3 attachment styles that really sort of show how parents can really regulate their children's affect and how they can help them sort of restore them back to baseline. So then that whole exploratory drive comes back in online again, then they would want to start playing again. Because remember, attachment is about safety. And here, this is a brilliant experiment where you put safety in as opposed to exploration. For a child to have all these new toys, it's amazing. But then if it's in danger, it doesn't want to explore. So you see how quickly can a child revert back from feeling very unsafe to safety. And again, as we talked before, what really helps people, like even those children, feel safe is the connection, is the type of connection with the parent. So these are the way that these attachment styles were found. And so the question is, but then the whole attached book is about adults. So what does it have to do with adults? So in 1987, 2 researchers, Hazen and Shaver, had this idea that also adults behave in very similar ways in the setting of close romantic relationships. And they did this experiment to look at this 3 attachment style, the anxious, the avoidant, and the secure, also play out in close adult romantic relationships. And they did this big experiment when they found out that that's the case. Only in child, like they didn't bring them into a strange situation their strange situation. They really looked at their attitudes towards closeness and intimacy and how easily it is how much of a sensitive radar system do people have for potential threat in a relationship, and how much do they love to be close in a relationship. And these are the two dimensions of the adult attachment style.
Is your attachment style as a child determinative of your attachment style as an adult? Does it just grow with you?
So no, it doesn't. There's some correlation, but it's not a very strong correlation.
Really?
And
Wow.
that's why I actually really love this whole field. I love this whole field because of a few things. First of all, it has nothing to do with pathology. Like having an anxious or an avoidant attachment style is not an illness. It's not pathological.
Right.
Whenever people say, "Oh, the secure attachment is the healthy attachment," no, that's not true. They're all within the norm. It's just there's a variation of the norm. It's like those big five. It's not that one is abnormal and one is normal. It's all a variation on the norm. And then the other thing is that there's a huge room for change. And so for someone who's a therapist like me, that's very promising because I want my patients to get better and change. And so if there's a huge room for change, and these attachment styles are basically, they're also called working models. It's a set of assumptions and perceptions, like what you actually perceive in the world and the assumptions that you have about the world that you're working with until proven otherwise. And that's very important because in therapy, part of what I like to do is I like to prove people otherwise if I can. And then that's what gives them people a chance to shift their working model. So if you have an anxious working model, that means that you love a lot of intimacy and closeness, but you also have a very sensitive radar for danger. So a lot of small, and what I mean danger from an attachment perspective is anything that can come in the way of closeness and the availability of the other person. So all of a sudden, if they don't call you or they're late for dinner or they disappear, for each and every person, we establish a certain baseline that we anticipate from. If a friend texts you once a week, you're not going to expect them to text you every day. But if a friend texts you every day and all of a sudden they don't text you one day, that will trigger the alarm system. So people who have an anxious working model have a very sensitive alarm system, but they love closeness. People who are secure don't have a very sensitive alarm system. A lot of things go over their head. They don't notice many things. Oh, they didn't call? Really? I didn't notice. I didn't really know. It's just they don't have a very sensitive alarm. But they do love a lot. They love closeness and intimacy, a lot of closeness and intimacy. And then the avoidant, there it's a little bit different. They don't feel too comfortable with too much closeness and intimacy. So they have these little things that they do that they instill some distance in their relationship, which are called deactivating strategies. So these are little things. We have a whole list in the book, I think, of deactivating strategies. It's like if you're on a romantic vacation, you walk a few steps ahead of your partner, for example. So it's a little bit, I mean, it's close, but there's a little bit of distance there, or little things that there's a lot of different ways that you can instill some distance in your relationship. So now you can easily see the two groups that kind of like really can get in trouble with one another. And that's the anxious and the avoidant, because one has a very sensitive radar and wants a lot of closeness. And the other doesn't want a lot of closeness, but also has instills a lot of threat in their relationship. So they drive each other crazy. So that's where a lot of relationship drama happens.
Those are a lot of the dysfunctional, quote unquote, dysfunctional relationships that we hear about and read about.
Yeah, it becomes really difficult because they keep craving closeness, but then they get triggered a lot, and the other like, stay away, and they try to push them away a lot, and it becomes an issue.
So I have found in studying personality psychology that, just like you said, it is the case that one trait isn't normative. There's not like a particular way to be like I want to shoot for agreeableness or whatever, but rather the idea is to be aware of the traits that you express and that you manifest in your life, and to harness them in ways that are useful and effective, and kind of carve out your niche based on your traits, on your temperament. And it seems to me that would be the same kind of deal with attachment theory. it's not that everyone, that was one of my questions that I wanted to ask you was, should we all be shooting for a secure attachment? And you kind of answer that. It's like, no, we're not all shooting for secure attachment. It's more that we have to be aware of our different attachment styles, what our attachment style is, and then manifest it in the most productive way we can. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So I would like to give an example. It sort of goes back a long time now, but one of my patients who has an anxious working model, one morning back in 2008, like woke up at 6 a.m. and sort of shook her husband and said, like, get up. Something doesn't feel right. You have to sell all of our stock. And he's like, what? No, you have to sell all of our stock. And he did. She wouldn't let up, and he sold all of their stock, and then the market crashed. It's just like people that have a sixth sense for potential danger. It's not nothing to scoff at. And even now, we know with the pandemic, there was a lot of differences between how careful people wanted to be. And sometimes some partners, because they were so vigilant, it could have been all the difference between life and death for some people. Because if they had a partner that really said, no, we're not going out, no, you're wearing all the masks, oh, you're doing all these things, it could have made the difference between actually making it or not making it through this pandemic. So there is, especially when times are dangerous, there is an advantage to having a sensitive sense for danger, because you can sort of spot it. And I'll give you another example. The building that just crashed in
Florida.
Miami. Yeah, they interviewed, I found it fascinating. They interviewed some of the people. There's some people who got out. And this woman said, I heard something. I went out. I left everything there. I knew. I was just like, I went out. Even she had like the birds or something. She left everything there. There was something in her that told her, you got to get out as soon as possible. If you were to ask me, I don't know if I would get out and would leave everything behind me. I probably would run after my dog. I probably wouldn't have made it, because I didn't have that sense of like urgency and danger that maybe someone else would. So it can pay off to have that trait.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful example of like the evolutionary adaptiveness of certain traits that we might in other contexts consider maladaptive, but in certain contexts they're adaptive, and in fact that's why they're here. Right? Exactly.
This woman ran out and she made it, which is crazy. It's scary, but it's true. So I've learned to really appreciate people's anxiety, and that's one of the things that I like. I would say it more like anxious working model. And part of what I try to do for patients that come to me and like in couples therapy is teach them, and that's the secret, that the thing is, the system, it doesn't need a lot. It's a primitive system. It doesn't need a lot. It doesn't need like hours and hours of heart-wrenching conversations. It doesn't need like for you to sort of be attached to the hip all the time. It needs, so that's the trick, is to learn what it needs. And once you learn what it needs, it has very, very simple needs. You can very, very easily satisfy this radar's need to make it not trip. So it needs basically you to be consistent and decide on a baseline. So you have to find out. Like I had one patient and she said, when my boyfriend goes to work, I can make it like very, very well, high functioning person, professional. I can make it maybe until 6 hours after he's gone. At that time, if I haven't heard from him, if there's not even a single text, I start to get uncomfortable and uneasy. So I said, you don't want to do that. You want to actually, I call it turning small flames before they become forest fires when it comes to attachment. You don't want to wait for the alarm to go off. You want to turn it off just before it goes off, right? So we agreed that her partner needs to text her after 4 hours after he's gone away. Just send a little text, and that's all she needed.
Yeah.
Hey, thinking about you. Hey, how's your day going? Mine's going well. That's all she asked for. And when he did that, things were great. But he really takes them away from that anxious avoidant thing where he's like, no, why do I need to do that? She should be able to do it on her own. She's not the boss of me. All of the different things, when you explain to people the physiology and how it works, and that you can really just like use very, very simple ways of putting that system at bay, then that system, it's not designed to be activated all the time. It's designed to sort of be like you're now sitting, talking to me quietly. I heard there's a little bit of kids in the background. You know that they're okay. It's right. You know that they're okay. You know that he's okay. If you thought that he wasn't okay, you wouldn't be able to have this conversation. But you want to have that quietness and peacefulness to be able to do whatever you want to do in your life. And that's what I try to teach people how to do. when they come with those incongruent attachment styles that are having such a hard time to. It's very simple. It's a simple little tricks that they can do to make things better.
Yeah. That seems to me to be the main benefit of understanding your attachment style is just that, just to inform other people of how to treat you and to know how to treat other people so that you guys can have a more harmonious relationship. I mean, is that the payoff?
It's exactly right. I'll give you another example, like the opposite example, someone who's avoidant, who came to me and like he saw like all these women who is sort of handsome, and so he dated all these women, but he felt suffocated right away because like he would really know how to show them a good time. He would take them out on dates, he would wine them and dine them, but like immediately they would want something more than he could give them. He felt really suffocated and just didn't understand what was wrong with him. And especially there was this one woman who was really good to him, and he wanted to fall in love with her. And he came to me hoping that I could teach him how to fall in love with her, but she really pressed him and he felt suffocated. And we tried with her to sort of like have him to tell him, look, I need the time and the space for myself, but she wasn't having it. And eventually it didn't really pan out. But then he met this woman. From the very get-go, he said, I need a lot of space and I need more time for myself. And then he met this woman, and lo and behold, she kind of like was in the same space as he was. And so sometimes they would sit together and go over her Tinder profile and kind of like decide who is like a potentially good match for her or not. There was more space in their relationship, and they both wanted that and needed that. And then slowly, they kind of like grew more and more closer and closer together, until now. I think they're barely even really interested in other people outside of their relationship. Although if they are, it's okay with them still. So you just have to find the right fit sometimes. And you have to sort of not feel that something is wrong with you, but be able to explain to other people, because otherwise it's just going to sort of happen again and again and again. And the good thing is that, and that's the one thing I didn't mention to you, is the distribution of the attachment styles.
Mm-hmm.
So I think most of the research, I mean, the findings are that around a little bit over 50% are secure, and about 20% are anxious, and about 25% are avoidant. There's a small percentage that are anxious avoidant, but that's very small. So the good news are most of the people are really secure. And that's very good news for the rest of the world that's not insecure. You can aggregate the anxious and avoidant as insecure, because when you're with someone who's secure, it makes your life much easier because they're not as threatened. They're not threatened too much if you text them all the time and you sort of need reassurance. And they're not threatened all the time if you need your alone time. And I had one of the editors that I work with for one of the science magazine told me, oh yeah, after she read the book, she loved the book. Yeah, I'm totally secure. And my husband is avoidant. But it really works out for me because I have to travel a lot for work, and I have to be out of the house. And he's totally fine with it. I can come and go as I please, and it's not a problem. So she's kind of like, she was happy with it.
Wow. So there are many different relationship configurations that can exist.
Many different, exactly. Yeah. So, in general, I think human experience is so vast. And that's part of the things that I try to really retain as a therapist and as a psychiatrist, because it's so easy for me to think like, oh, it's this or it's that, and to really prematurely pigeonhole, like sort of put people into categories. But I try to really resist that and try to listen to people and kind of like really appreciate how the vastness of human experience, and that different people experience things differently sometimes, and it's nuanced. And so it's important.
Yeah. Definitely. My wife and I are both secure attachments, and we were reflecting on how that just really made for a very whirlwind romance, in the sense that we met each other and then we moved in together like 3 months later. Like we were both very
I love that.
Happy with how everything was going, so it was very funny.
It's easy, right?
Yeah.
I know my partner is also very secure. And also with him, I think the partner that he had before me, like they met in Australia and they spent like 3 weeks together. And then later on, his boyfriend, like he came over here, and then they were together for more than a decade. It's just like, it's easy. It goes easily for people that are secure. Like closeness comes easy. Yeah. It's not like people think, no, relationships are hard work. I think what happens is, in general, it's because oftentimes what we watch in movies, like that's part of the things that I've learned, like through the whole process of writing the book. I really learned to appreciate the secures in this world, because oftentimes we kind of like don't really notice them as much. We kind of notice a lot more the insecure people in our lives, because
The secures are boring.
because it seems like they're boring. They always reply to you when you email them. There's never really any drama. So it's kind of like you don't really pay attention to them. And a lot of your attention goes to those who didn't invite you, those who dissed you, those who actually canceled.
Yeah.
And so part of what I do, and not just in romantic relationships, in general, I try to teach my patients to shift their focus to kind of like, I don't say like, oh, you have to chuck away all of the insecure people in your life and never talk to them again.
Right.
Sort of to lower the volume on insecurity, and then to shift your gaze. And that's the one thing also about attachment styles, is that, like I told you, it's a working model. And we see certain things and take in certain facts, but we always ignore some things. We can't always comprehend everything that the world is giving us. And we tend to, what we observe and not observe depends a lot on the working model or our attachment style.
Yeah.
So I try to really show people who have, like, let's say, an anxious attachment style or an avoidant attachment style, that there are people in their lives that are secure, and to appreciate that instead of like go after the insecure, because that's where a lot of the emotional turmoil goes, and to kind of like appreciate it and give it more room in their lives. And I really have to say that it really causes a huge change, even just a slight shift towards more sort of like creating a more secure environment for yourself causes a huge shift in these people's lives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm writing a book right now, and it has to do with how honoring conflicting values creates well-being, essentially, and creates harmony in various ways. And so I'm interested in conflicting values structures. And so that's how I came across your book, in fact, because one of the ways in which I conceptualize attachment theory in general is as a way to balance two conflicting needs, I would say. And one of those needs is like the need for autonomy. And this is a whole kind of dimension of human experience, I would say. It has to do with being free and being self-determining creatures and being able to do what you want, to express yourself how you want, and having autonomy, right? And that's a deep need, and that has real deep evolutionary roots. But and maybe it has to do with living in a tribe and having to living with people who would maybe assert dominance over you and needing to break free from that, right? Then there's another opposing need, which is the need for connection. And this is the idea that, look, we need relationships. Like, yeah, we need to be individuals, but we also need relationships. And underlying that need is this need to be part of something else, to be part of a group, to be accepted, to in some ways conform to certain norms. And we think of conformity as a bad thing, in Western culture, but we all conform to something. And so the way I think about it is like this idea that attachment theory is describing the relationship between the two. And it's like, if you have that security, that connection, then you can be more of yourself. You can be more of an individual. You can be more autonomous if you feel more secure. And I think that's so interesting. And this kind of leads into the discussion of codependency, because that word is thrown around a lot. And people today, I think modern people especially, are very concerned about relying too much on other people and about being too dependent on other people. And you kind of articulate this in the book, that a lot of what passes for codependency or what described as codependency is actually not. It's actually just a healthy relationship attachment. Could you kind of just talk about the difference between codependency and just like regular good, healthy relationship bonds?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought it up. And I think the way you summarize it is very accurate. We're referring to what I think even we mentioned that in the book, we call it the dependency paradox, that in order we understand the way that our physiology works, in order to become independent, you have to find someone to depend on, someone dependable to depend on, to walk down that path of independence with. Which sounds a little bit strange, right? But if you think about it from the point of view of that strange situation test, where you have the toddler with the parent in the room. And if they feel safe and they know that there's someone there that makes them feel safe, they can venture into the room and play, and they can, like, you can really leave them there. They'll be completely into, like, they can play for hours and hours, right? But they need to know that there's someone who's got their back. And that's kind of like the way that you also kind of like, I think, described how this autonomy works in the best way, is that we know that someone has our back, even if you're in the same house and you know that your wife is somewhere else, like in the same room,
Right.
under the same, or even someone that can reach out to you or text you after 6 hours or whatever. That gives you the peace and quiet that you need to actually create and sort of be the autonomous being that you want to be. So that's,
Yeah.
we call that the dependency paradox. So that, I think, oftentimes comes into the whole sort of codependency movement is, I think, is very problematic. It's problematic because it comes from a good place, I think. It comes
Yeah.
from the place of, what do you do, from the addiction literature? What do you do when you have someone that really depends on you, and that if you assist them, you're actually enabling them and making their disease worse? And so that becomes a big problem. And then that's when they talk often about, oh, you're codependent. You went and the person came home and they were very weak, like after binge drinking or whatever, and you help them and you nurse them and you give them money, and then they went out and did the same thing again, and you can't just break loose from it. And then the whole dependency thing got a bad rep of, no, two people need to be autonomous and they need to do on their own, and they should just come as two adults, and everyone has to take care of their own needs. And as two adults, they should be able to come together and be together and then go back and each take care of their own needs. But you know something? I mean, it sounds nice to me too. Because then all the potential pain of breakups and potential of people not meeting your expectations, and sometimes people upset you, all of that could disappear. What better could that be? Unfortunately, that's not our biology.
Right.
Our biology does not really
Right.
agree to that. And there's even a physiological difference between being alone and being apart. And you alluded to that a little bit in the grief. With grief, there's a physiological difference when we're apart from someone, that you know this person is not here. But once they're there and you sort of form a bond with them, there's changes in our brain that happen that kind of like leaves a configuration of them. They literally get etched in our brain.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment they separate from us, we become very unsettled. And that's why I said it's often really good to see it in dogs, because it's so easy to see it in dogs or in babies. Like if a dog and his owners, I don't know, if they leave them outside of the store, if you'll try to engage with a dog, they wouldn't even know. They keep like their eyes where their owner is. But if their owners are there, they'll be easy. It'll be easier for them to engage with you. Like that owner is etched in the dog's brain. The inavailability of the owner triggers a stress response. So that's why being alone is not the same as being apart, because being apart triggers a stress response.
Mm-hmm.
And being alone, if you don't have a person who is unique and special, then they're there or not there. It won't matter, right?
Right.
So I guess it's maybe a roundabout way. Maybe there's a better way to explain it. But I think the whole idea of codependency is that someone is really sick, and when you're helping them, you're not really making them better. So you need to stop helping them. But then it became into this whole thing about people needing to do things on their own. But it doesn't really hold up to our biology, because when we basically get attached to someone, we become one physiological unit. And there's all these studies that show that it affects our blood pressure, our heart rate, it affects our immune system. There's, I think, one study a long time ago that showed if you're in a good relationship and you get a cut, it heals faster than if you're in a bad relationship. So it's really that profound. We really can't control it. You may want to control it, but we can't control it. So the idea is to really find the right person to depend on. And I think that's kind of like the main thing. And the codependency issue comes when the other person that you're depending on, it's not dependable. Like if someone is a drug addict or an alcoholic, that they all of a sudden will go on a bender and you won't see them and you don't know what to do, and you're driving yourself mad with worry. And the people tell you, oh, you have a problem, you're codependent, you worry too much.
Right.
Put the focus on yourself. Why you worry too much about them? Well, it's because we have a physiology in place that we can't escape that physiology. And so it all stems from that place, and it really goes against our basic biology. I just like that's the best way to describe it, I think.
Yeah. I have this phrase that I think of often. It's like, personal development and evolution of the individual is kind of like knowing what kind of creature you are so you can evolve yourself into the kind of creature you ought to be. But it starts with knowing the reality of what kind of creature you are. And
Oh, completely.
yeah,
I
yeah.
completely agree with you. What is our biological substrate?
Mhm.
What are we working with? Right?
Right.
I'm sorry, that's what we're working with. I can't
Yeah.
really reinvent our brain. But the other thing is, like when you, and I'm glad that you mentioned that you and your wife are secure, because when you talk to secure people, and that's what I also love about attachment, that I told you, it's not about healthy or sick. It's about, is it effective or ineffective? Is it working for you or is it not
Mhm.
working for you? I have a friend whose parents owned a jewelry store in the city, and they lived together and worked together for decades upon decades upon decades. They did everything together, and he worked for them. So some people say, oh my God, they're enmeshed with each other. They're totally like their lives are too intertwined with each other. But they actually built an amazing empire. They actually then had a chain of stores and they did all of it together. So who am I to say that and especially that that's like an illness or that's codependency? It totally
Mhm.
worked for them.
Right. We've gotten that actually. My wife and I have received that same kind of feedback from people, kind of back in the day when we were I guess when we were younger. We've been together about 10 years, and so. But we actually we met at a job. We worked at an insurance company together, and then we moved in together. We started living our lives, and then we both got another job at the same place. We got another job selling cars together. And this idea of just being together all the time, we were attached at the hip. People had different names for us, like they called us in Spanish as chicle, which means gum, and like we were stuck together.
Oh,
And
right. I like that.
yeah, and so, but we didn't experience any dysfunction. Obviously, we had the regular disagreements or whatever, but
Right.
but we didn't experience any dysfunction in our relationship. And so it's like, well, why should I have to be someone who wants more space if it works for us, So
Exactly. And that's the danger of this whole codependency thing, that it can take people who have more than perfectly good, like really good relationships and potentially make them feel bad.
yeah.
Like, right. And it's completely misaligned with our biology and also misaligned with so many normal couples that are out there that function so well together. And that's the other problem is most people who come to see psychologists and psychiatrists and most people who write stories about relationships, a lot of it has to have like a certain element of like the stories and the movies, it has to have a certain element of drama. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
drama oftentimes it has to be with breakups and things like that. Or if they come to treatment, they come because they have problems. So there's a lot of people out there who are very, very close and attached at the hip who are having wonderful relationships. They're just like we don't know anything about because they're just busy having their great relationships.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Like a movie about two securely attached people isn't necessarily a blockbuster.
So, but there are a few things, and that's another aspect it's something that's called secure priming, where there's a lot of research that shows that you can actually secure prime people who are insecure. And some of it is by watching certain movies or like in
Mm.
therapy, you can talk to them and show them a more secure perspective. Because again, it's a working model. And you can show them like people in therapy, it's like, well, do you really think that he only cares about his adult daughter? But it sounds like he really loves you a lot, and he also cares, and he did all these things for you. Like they get stuck only. They see the danger becomes huge, and the other things that they're doing and all the love and the security becomes small. All they have to do is kind of like enlarge
Mm.
safety, and they can see it, and then okay, they can shift their working model. So that's called secure priming. So some of it is also watching certain movies, and like the one movie that I love to show that actually is not. There is a conflict there, but it's not an insecure conflict. It's My Big Fat Greek Wedding.
Oh, okay.
There, the conflict is more cultural conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Like she meets someone secure, and then she doesn't know how he's going to be able to integrate her. She's Greek Orthodox. How's she going to be able to integrate this sort of like waspy thing into her life? And then he's very secure, and he just goes all the way and kind of like and gets integrated into her life. And so that's a movie to watch if you want to do some secure priming.
Cool. Good recommendation.
Yeah.
Actually, I had a couple technical questions, that may bore some people, but I'm curious about them. So one of them is you in your book, we've been talking about three attachment styles primarily: the anxious style, the avoidant style, and then the secure style. But poking around on the internet, you can find other names, other labels for styles like anxious, ambivalent, dismissive, avoidant. Are these different frameworks, or are they just variations of these three styles?
It gets very complicated, actually, but
Okay.
these are sort of variants of the same, just like different names of the same styles. Avoidant dismissive is basically avoidant.
Okay.
Anxious ambivalent is basically anxious. So it's basically the same. It gets a little bit complicated when you look and see about just childhood attachment styles, then become your adult attachment styles. It's like, what are the differences? And then
Okay. I
there's
see.
other things that become even more complicated. There's like different measures of attachment styles.
Yeah, I know that makes sense. That clears it up. I mean, personality in general, I think, is complicated and it's very nuanced. So it makes sense that there's a lot of different labels for things. The other thing I wanted to ask you was, I guess, is from my own curiosity also, is from a, and I keep coming back to personality because that's where I know some things, and it seems like it's related to attachment theory at least to some degree, but it seems that the literature shows that it's personality is stable across one's lifetime, at least to a large degree. But you're saying that attachment style as a child doesn't determine yours as an adult. So how do you reconcile those things?
And not only that, even in adulthood, people can and do change their attachment styles.
Okay.
So it's much more fluid, which is
Okay.
part of, I think, what I told you, why I like about it so much, because it's very, for me as a therapist, means there's a lot of promise there.
Yeah.
I think what happens, that's kind of like, I like to think about what happens both in therapy or like when you meet someone secure, or like if you're in a relationship with someone secure and they show you, for example, for someone anxious or for someone avoidant, and they show you, oh, life is not so dangerous after all. You can sort of relax. You can let your guard down. Then with time, as you see that, your working model changes.
Mm.
And then you become a little bit different, potentially more secure. I don't know if it will hold. And maybe if something happens and you separate, or like your partner dies, and then you go on to another relationship, some of the radar and the danger may come back.
Mm.
But a lot of the attachment styles is also about what happens in the space between two people. And that's where I think it maybe makes a little bit different than the personalities, because it
Okay.
really depends also on the other. It's a dyadic process.
Mm.
And oftentimes, all of my editors like take out the word dyad from when I write it in the book, because they said that it's too professional. But I really like that whole dyadic idea. It's very hard for us to think about something that happens in the space between two people,
Mm-hmm.
because it's hard, because we can either focus on one person and then we focus on the other person. How do we look at what happens in the middle? It's much more challenging, but that's what attachment is all about, is about what happens in the space between two
Mm.
people. And that's why when people say, they come to me and they say, I have an anxious working model, and now I need to, like, I have this one patient. It's like, I need you to just like rip it out of me. I need you to rip it out of me. So I want to become secure, just so you're like doing like surgery, take out all the anxiety. And the thing is, it's not really about that. It's more about, or like, even like this whole idea, and I'm not against, I think it's actually great to use mindfulness and meditation and different techniques to calm oneself down. But I think also we are a social species, extremely social. And so we react to our social environment in a very, very, very powerful way.
Yeah.
And we all know that, because if something bad happens to you and you reach out to your wife, let's say, and sometimes within seconds, she can make it better.
Yeah.
And I even say there's not even the best of Xanax can do that. Uh,
Right.
it's just like
Yep.
the best possible way. But on the other hand, I heard it in a lecture once that someone said that one of the most powerful ways to regulate our affect is through secure attachment to someone, because we're a social species, and it's
Yeah.
a very powerful way to regulate affect, like in that strange situation test. But also one of the most powerful ways to dysregulate affect, to create emotional distress, is by insecure attachments. All of a sudden, people disappear on you, don't talk to
Yeah.
you. So attachment is really both at the basis of suffering and healing from suffering. And that whole change in the dynamic in the dyad can really shift people's working models And that's why there's so much room for work if you're a therapist, because you can help to sort of change something that's in the space between people and the rest of their world by helping them shift their general social milieu, by helping them shift little things. Like I told you, it's not the big things, it's the little things that really matter. In my new book, I go into something that I call them SIMIs. It's the seemingly insignificant minor interactions of everyday life. It's those SIMIs that really matter to the brain, to our social brain. And so I really try to help patients focus on those SIMIs in order to sort of to realign certain things and help them sort of live better with their attachment styles.
Wow, that sounds very helpful. Is there a title for your new book, or is that not disclosed yet?
It's not disclosed yet.
Okay. I'm patiently awaiting that, but anxiously awaiting that. No, I'm securely awaiting that. That's great. Those are really good answers. It seems like basically that it's not just personality at play and attachment style. There's also the dynamic between people that is another factor. And it seems like yes, biology is part of it, part of your working model, but also there's an environmental factor that you can actually manipulate to help
in a huge way. But you have to remember that we have, so let's say I'm going to work with you and you're going to meditate and you're going to do everything that in your power to sort of keep it together and keep it cool. And then you come home and your wife doesn't say hello to you and she sort of slams the door in your face. I mean, I'm sorry, all the mindfulness in the world is not going to help sort of that's very powerful. There's not maybe it might help to attenuate that, but this is our biology. We are very much a social species, and a lot of the work has to be done in that space. And a lot of the time, what I do with patients is that I really try to work, and I got that also from being a child psychiatrist. There's something that's called PCIT. It's parent-child interaction therapy, where you place, again, it's through one-way mirror. You bring a child and the parent into the room, and you give them, the mother or the father, an earpiece. And all it is about telling the mother and the father to ignore behavior that's not constructive, and then also only give good feedback for constructive behavior. Because this is kids that are very disruptive, and it's related to attachment. Any attention is better than no attention. So even bad attention is if you understand the attachment logic, is better than ignoring. So you see the kids are playing with cubes and they're slashing and stashing and everything, and then you tell the parent in the earpiece, ignore. Don't say anything. You could they want to no, what are you doing? No, ignore. And then they put one cube on top of another one. It's oh, how wonderful it is that you're putting these two cubes together. And you teach them how to sort of shift their way of doing it. So a lot of the stuff I started to do also with patients in real time, adult patients, when they get into a situation with their partner, they can text me. And if I'm available, I will help them see things a little bit differently in real time so the danger doesn't take over, and then sort of send them into to help them shift into a more secure stance to dissipate a lot of potential downfall later on. And that really works.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we've been adopting that exact philosophy with parenting also. We have a 2-year-old, and so I totally resonate with that. It's attention is good and no attention is bad. And so even negative attention is a reinforcement of some sort. So for sure. Yeah, I've noticed that also.
Huge, because it's about it's about safety, right?
Yeah.
And attention, you have to understand, you have to place our safety not where we are now, but let's say, I don't know if you've ever been on a safari, but you're outside where maybe that's why I have this whole safari thing in the background.
I love it.
It's scary because it's outside where you're basically in the middle of the food chain. So not being, especially for a child, having attention of a parent, that meant potentially that could mean all the difference between life and death.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
So it's an instinctive thing. You see it also with dogs. They don't like you not noticing them. Attachment has its own logic. And that's what I try to teach a lot of my patients. It has its own different logic. Sometimes it may seem crazy to people, but it's not crazy. It has its own logic, and it's a very, very powerful system. So I try to teach people to, rather than fight it, it won't work for you to fight it, to try to understand its logic and try to accommodate it. But the thing is, it's very easy to accommodate it usually. Doesn't take a lot. And
Yeah.
so when people sort of get it, like understand it, they get much better.
It is a very simple framework to grasp fundamentally. And I agree. Once you understand the basic dynamics and the basic logic of the framework, it's very easy to apply. And then kind of you start to notice people. You start to okay,
Totally.
anxious, secure. Okay, cool, got it. And then
Yeah.
from there, you can just adjust your behavior. You can just adjust, and even if nothing changes, but your perception of their behavior, it's like that's a world of a difference, because
That's already a big change,
yeah,
for sure.
exactly. So
that's what a lot of anxious people do, is they take things really personally, because that's the danger thing. Oh, my partner is like, I don't know, closes himself up in his room and doesn't speak to me because he's working, right? But it's like, then it's like, oh, he doesn't love me. There's this, that. That's because it's like, it really is an activating strategy to send them to sort of create the connection again. So if you understand the logic of why that thought comes up as a means to kind of like, okay, now I got to reach out because like I can't really let him get away from me. Then you can sort of like, okay, I need some more reassurance. I can't let him be stuck in his room all day. I need some in the middle, take a few breaks and sort of say hi or something. You just have to sort of like listen to it and learn how to work with it.
You said something earlier that it's not about pathologizing. And I think that's such a useful insight, because one of the things that shifted my perspective on personality and attachment theory and just human behavior in general, I would say, was the idea that I guess it's an idea of acceptance of a diversity of personalities and a diversity of modes of being in the world. And that just because something is different, just because some mode of being is different from how I am, it doesn't mean that it's actually bad. And it actually biologically is very, or evolutionarily rather, has been very useful. And so there's some value in it. Seeing the value in other people's modes of being and personality has been something that I've really meditated on a lot and written a lot about, and kind of what I'm trying to articulate here with my new book. So yeah, I think that's right. To not view everything the different as you as a pathology, I guess is the lesson.
And it goes very, very far and deep. It's a basic principle in biology, not just for us. I even show people, I show in some of my talks, how that sort of need for, like that in some people, there's going to be a need for distance, for more distance, is really ingrained in our biology. And a lot of people think that avoidance comes from trauma or from sort of feeling that people have failed you in relationships, that you can't trust anyone. And perhaps some of it does, but I also think that it really is deep-rooted in our biology, because you look even at very simple organisms. And that's why I love to show this. I have this little movie that I try to show in my talks about C. elegans. So C. elegans is a very simple worm, microscopic worm, that neuroscientists love. We study it all the time because it has a very big nervous system that is completely mapped out. And C. elegans has two different types of feeding behavior: an aggregate feeding behavior and a solitary feeding behavior. So you put some food there and there's like tons of worms that will aggregate, like you put a huge lump, a huge pile of worms. And then there's a bunch of them that have solitary eating behavior. So if one swims in one direction, the other one will swim in the other direction. They never aggregate. And it's chemotactically so. They swim away because there's some chemicals that are released that they find aversive. So it's chemotactically, it works. And I think it's a single gene, and you can change and create, you can switch and aggregate to a solitary and vice versa. And you can see that there will be like a huge advantage in having the pile of worms, because they thought, whoa, hey guys, there's lots of food here, come have some food. There's a huge evolutionary advantage for that. But also there's an advantage to having some of them, no, we prefer to stay on the outskirts of this, because if all of a sudden they become a huge pile of prey, you'll be on the outskirts of it, right? So there's a huge evolutionary advantage to having this heterogeneity, as you say. And it really runs so deep in our biology, and it like runs wide and deep in our biology across a whole of phylogeny, and I believe also in humans. And I meet some of the patients that I have, they don't feel comfortable with too much closeness. It's kind of like they just want to jump out of the skin. And I really think that some of it, and there is some papers that suggest that some of it has to do also with genetic heterogeneity.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. We've had to navigate such a wide variety of environments and social situations that we've developed a lot of strategies with which to deal with those things. So it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I really appreciate you articulating that. I want to be respectful of your time here. I could talk with you for a long time. I hope we can talk again, actually, in the future, because
That'd be great.
about your new book. That I've really enjoyed this conversation. Is there anything you wanted to leave our audience with? Any message? Any tagline or something?
I think I said a lot of stuff throughout. That's all the stuff that was really important for me. Like, for example, to appreciate the secure people in your lives more, and to increase the volume on security in your life, because we tend to underestimate and even just ignore the secure people in our lives. And also just to remember about how like that attachment is really the base of both suffering and then also healing from suffering. So, and we have that ability, social ability to change. It's a call for change, and it's a huge. It's really a very. I see it all the time. Also in my practice, it's a very useful framework for change. So, with that, I think that's how I'd like to leave people with.
It's beautiful. I think people are going to get a lot out of this conversation. Amir, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for listening. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes on my website at thinkgrowprosper.com/podcast. That's where I put all the links and resources mentioned in each episode. It's also where I put the outlines of topics covered, which is a really good way to refer back to episodes in the future. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to leave a review on iTunes with your biggest takeaway. I make it a point to read all the reviews. You can also screenshot this episode and share it to your social media along with something you learned or found interesting. And tag me in your post because I'd love to see what you found interesting. Say hi and thank you for your support.